In this lesson, we'll add the first layer of short fuzz to our fox model. Let's begin. It's time to add some fuzz to this little guy. We'll have some nice looking fuzz by the end of this lesson. However, it won't be the correct color. We'll be handling the material in the next lesson, but I wanted to warn you before we start that the fuzz is going to be pure white for the rest of this lesson, and not match the orange material applied to the fox model. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. First, make sure that you have the left viewport set to the rendered view by clicking this button here found on the far right at the top of this viewport. If for some reason you don't see these buttons here on the far right, you might need to hover over this toolbar here and then click in your middle mouse button to pan it back and forth so that you can see these buttons here on the far right side. Now in the right viewport over here, make sure that you have this fox's head selected. You'll see it here highlighted in orange. And now with the head selected, hit Shift and A on your keyboard, and this will bring up the Add menu. We'll be using a relatively new way to add hair to our model that was introduced a few versions ago. This method will use curves and geometry nodes to create hair on our model. Luckily for us, you don't really need to know how either of those things work in order to use this method, as it's simplified down into just a few easy modifiers. So let's add our hair now by going down here to Curve, and then choosing Fur. Right away, we can see that our model has become a lot fuzzier in both of the viewports. The left viewport shows that white fuzz that I mentioned earlier in the beginning of this lesson. Our next steps will be adjusting the look of this fur to better resemble curly wool fibers. We'll be making these changes in the Modifiers panel for this new Curves object that was just parented to the fox head object. We can find the modifiers down here at the bottom right by clicking on this little blue wrench icon. Before we get too far, let's rename this curve object so that's something a bit more accurate to what it actually is. So over here in our list, we can find the word curves here just underneath the fox head object in which it's parented to. And then we can just double click on this word curves and we'll type in short fuzz and then hit enter. I mentioned a few times now that this fur has been parented to this fox head object. We can tell easily that it's been parented to it because this short fuzz object lives inside this fox head object. So if I twirl this closed, you'll see the fuzz disappears, and that's because it's actually located within inside this object. This means that anytime we adjust the position, the rotation, or the scale of the head, the parented fuzz object will follow. This just makes sure that the fuzz stays attached to the head regardless of what you do with the head. Alright, let's begin making adjustments to the fuzz. Our first step is going to be cleaning up the modifiers a little bit by simply collapsing them to make adding and moving them easier. To do this, we're just going to go down to this list down here at the bottom and then click on these tiny arrows at the left of each of these modifiers. And you'll see here that it just collapsed them and makes it easier to view them. Now let's add two new modifiers that will help us control the look of the hair. To do this, we'll go over here to the Add Modifier button, click here, and then we're going to choose Search, and then we'll type in Trim, T-R-I, and then we'll see here Trim Hair Curves. And we can select this from the list. We'll reposition this modifier in the list in just a moment. Let's add one more modifier. We'll go over here to the Add Modifier button, click Search again, and this time we'll type in Curl, C-U-R-L, and then choose Curl Hair Curves. Alright, now it's time to reposition these modifiers. Each modifier adds to the effects of those beneath them, so adjusting the order of the modifiers can make a big difference in the way that the hair is rendered. You can adjust the placement of the modifiers in the list by clicking and dragging the small dots on the right side and then moving them around within the row. First, let's go down here and twirl these closed so that's a little bit easier to see them. And now let's rearrange some of these modifiers into a better order based on the effects that they have on the hair. I'll explain what each of these modifiers do as we go through them one by one later. So our first step is to grab this Trim Hair Curves, just grabbing these dots here on the right side, and we're going to move it to the second position here from the top, and then we'll go down here to the Curl Hair Curves, and drag this to the fourth position just below this Interpolate Hair Curves. And then lastly, we're going to move Frizz Hair Curves up one level so it's just below Curl. So now just take a moment, look at my list, and make sure that your list is in this exact same order. Okay, so the fox is looking pretty wild at this point, but it's just a few adjusted sliders from having adorable fuzz. Before we make any adjustments to the fuzz, one important thing I did want to point out is the difference in the way that the hair appears in the left versus the right viewport. We'll notice over here in the left viewport that we have nice smooth curves in each of these spirals, whereas on the right side, we're seeing really jagged lines, and everything just looks a little bit more crunchy and hard and less soft. This difference is only visible in the viewport, and the true appearance of the hair is actually a lot more similar to this left viewport. So if it ever seems like the hair is jagged in the right viewport, or it seems a bit sparse, please know that it will render much smoother and more dense than that. Okay, so now let's go through each of these modifiers from top to bottom and get a brief understanding of what they do while we adjust the settings. We'll start over here at the very top by twirling open Set Hair Curve Profile by clicking on this little arrow here to the left. Our first change is going to be adjusting the radius found here. So let's click on this value here, and then we're going to type in 0.000, so 3 zeros, and then 6, 5, and then hit enter. The purpose of this modifier, the Set Hair Curves Profile, simply changes the thickness and the overall shape of the hair. The main thing that we adjusted here was the radius of each individual hair, changing how thick a single strand of hair is. So in our case, we made this hair a good bit thinner than it was before by lowering this value. The factor min and the factor max adjust the thickness of the tip of the hair and the root of the hair respectively. So this min changes how thin the tip of the hair is, and the max changes how thick the base of the hair is, or the root. In our case, having it set to min 0 means that the hair will come to a very tiny point at the tip, and then the factor set to max 1 means that it'll be wider at the base or the root of the hair, which is exactly what we're looking for. This is how most hair would be shaped. Now that we're done with this modifier, we can simply twirl it closed to clean up the view, and then we're going to go to the next one, which is the Trim Hair Curves. So we can twirl this one open now. Again, we have just one value to change here, and that's going to be the length. So we can click on length here, and then we'll type in 0.0225 and then hit enter. This trim modifier allows us to easily control how long the individual hairs are. We want relatively short fuzz, so we used a much smaller number than what was there by default. While we won't be using these other parameters here within this modifier, some of the other useful sliders here are the length factor. This allows you to multiply the length of the hair by a new value to make slight adjustments to the hair length. For example, higher values mean longer hair, and shorter values mean shorter hair. In our case, we want it to be exactly what we typed in here, so we're just going to leave this set to 1. Another interesting slider here is the random offset. This allows you to have the hair trimmed at random lengths to give it a slightly more natural look. We'll be handling this randomness in a different way, but you might find this useful in your own personal projects. You can add a little randomness to the length of your hairs by simply adjusting this value. Increasing the number will make the hair a bit more random in terms of its length. For our case, we're going to set this back down to 0. As I said before, we'll be handling this randomness in a different way. Now let's move on to our next modifier. So we can twirl this one closed and then move to Interpolate Hair Curves. We'll twirl this one open. We have a few different things to adjust here, and the order we change them in matters. So we need to make sure that we do them in the correct order. First, let's change this viewport amount down here to 0.05 and then hit enter. This will make the hair look significantly less dense than it was, but this is only true in the viewport display. What I mean by this is that the hair is technically just as dense as it was before we made this change, but we forced Blender to restrict how much it shows us in the viewport to prevent the program from becoming too laggy or crashing. We'll still see the full density of the hair in the final render though. This is incredibly important when using higher hair density values, which we'll be doing in just a moment, especially on lower powered computers like laptops. If at any point in this class you notice that Blender is becoming too slow to effectively work in it, adjust this viewport value to something smaller. In your case, maybe 0.025 might be better, which is half of the value that we currently have now. For the purposes of this lesson, I'm going to leave mine at 0.05, but know that you can always make this view lower and it won't change the way that the actual final image renders. This is especially important if you have a weaker computer. Now we can increase the density value to a significantly higher value thanks to us lowering the viewport amount first. We can do that over here where it says density. We're going to click on this number and then type in 20 and then 000. 3 more zeros after this. So 20,000. The hair in the viewport might look pretty much identical to how it looked before, but it's actually about 20 times more dense than it was. It just looks the same because of the lower viewport density that we set. This higher density value will allow us to have a lot more hair and have it fully cover the surface of the fox's head to make a more believable woolly fuzz. Next, we're going to be limiting where the fuzz is allowed to be using a density mask. I've already created this mask for us by using the weight paint tools within the Fox head model. I won't be explaining this masking process in depth for this lesson, as I've already handled it for us. For this part in the lesson, you can just watch, please don't follow along, as this mask is already finished, but it should help to see what this mask looks like and how it will affect the fuzz placement. So first I need to select the Fox head, and then I'm going to go up here, I'll switch it to weight paint. And now if I zoom in here on the fox's head, you'll see generally this whole head is red, except for a few areas such as the nose and around the eyes here. These areas are instead shown in blue with a little bit of green and yellow around them. This blue means that the density is set to 0% in these areas, meaning that we're telling Blender to not place any fuzz in these areas, as they will look a lot better without any hair growing from the eyes or the nose. The areas in red have the density set to 100%, so Blender knows to put as much hair as it wants in those areas. So now that you see what this mask looks like, let's go back to the modifiers and actually apply it so Blender knows not to put any hair in these areas. So first I need to jump back to object mode, and then I'm going to select the short fuzz again, and then we can go back down here. I'll also adjust this view just so it looks a bit more similar to the left side. So to attach this mask that I just showed you to the density, we can go here to where it says density mask. We're going to click on this little icon here on the right side with the plus sign in the middle of it. After clicking this icon, now you can click on this dark field here to the left, and we're going to choose remove fur, which is what I named that mask that I just showed you. This has now applied this mask to the density of our fur. We won't really notice a huge difference to the hair at the moment, but it will become more obvious as we continue. The last adjustment for this modifier is down here, and it's called seed. We're going to set our seed to 4 instead of 0. So we'll just type in 4 and then hit enter. The seed value is simply a slider that randomizes the position of the hair. It doesn't change the overall quality of the hair or its density or anything like that. It simply tells Blender to redo the hair with a slightly different placement to provide a similar but different look. This change doesn't make a whole lot of sense at the moment, but I found in my experimenting that this seed value in particular created a better look for the short fuzz, especially in the final render, so we're going to use it for now. Now we're ready for our next modifier, so we can twirl this one closed, and then we're going to twirl open curl hair curves. Let's go through the changes one by one, and then we'll explain what we did. So first we're going to change the factor down to 0.2, and then hit enter. We'll change the curl start to 1, the radius to 0.25, and then finally the frequency to 5. We've made quite a few changes here, so let's go through what this modifier does and what each of these sliders we changed do for the fuzz. In basic terms, this modifier adds a curl effect to each of the hairs. This will allow us to achieve a similar look to the curls of a woolly fiber. So the factor slider that we changed here, you can think of this as an overall strength of the curling effect. Lower numbers make the hair overall less curly. By lowering this value, we've allowed the hair to spread out more across the head and be less clumped up into large curls. The curl start value found down here, this determines how much of each hair receive the curling effect. Higher numbers cause more of the overall hair strand to receive the curling effect. So if you lower this value, that means that less and less of the hair actually receives the curl. So it might start out straight and then curl only at the tip. If you have a higher value like we have here, the hair starts curling immediately from where it grows. The radius value just below it controls how large the individual curls are. If you want really tight, springy curls, smaller values work better here. If you want big, more flowing curls, then you would want a larger radius value. And then lastly, the frequency found down here at the bottom. This slider determines how many curls are present on each strand of hair. Higher values will create the springier curls that we're after. If you wanted less curls overall across the entire hair, you would want a lower value. Or if you wanted them even springier and even tighter curls, you would want a higher value. Now we can move on to the frizz hair curves. So we're going to turn this down and then twirl this open here so we can see these values. Let's start by adjusting the values and then I'll explain what we did. So first, for the distance, we're going to set this to 0.25. The shape, we're going to set to 0.05. And then down here, we're going to check on this preserve length button. This frizz modifier adds a zigzag noise to each strand of hair, causing the fuzz to be a lot more chaotic. This help replicates the way that the barbed needle of actual needle felting weaves together the shapes of the fibers. The sliders for this modifier aren't quite as straightforward and obvious, unfortunately. So for the distance value that we changed here, in basic terms, this slider adjusts the amount of frizz present in the hair. In general, larger numbers make the hair more frizzy. And then the shape value that we changed here, this slider controls how strong the frizz pattern is on each strand of hair. The lower numbers will cause a sharper, more chaotic frizziness. And then lastly, probably the most important setting on this frizz hair curves is this preserved length. So if we don't turn this on, we'll notice that the hair gets really, really long. And that's because these effects here are being applied on top of all of these other adjustments and making the hair significantly longer than we want it. If we turn on preserve length, that'll make sure that this modifier doesn't affect the length of the hair, only the frizz within the hair. So it tells Blender to look at the length of the hair that it was before we started applying these effects, and then make sure that it doesn't make it any longer after adjusting these things. So it tells Blender to look at the length of the hair before we started making any changes here, and then make sure that the hair ends up basically the same length as it was before, and not this really long fuzzball that it turns into without this. So make sure you have preserve length turned on. Now let's move on to the final adjustment that we're going to make, and that's to the hair curves noise. So we can twirl this closed, and then twirl open this last modifier here. And we're not really going to be changing a whole lot here. We're just going to be checking on a few boxes. So first we're going to uncheck cumulative effect, and then we're going to check on preserve length. This hair curves noise modifier is responsible for adding a bit of randomization to the hair overall, making it feel less computer generated and a bit more natural. By unchecking cumulative offset here at the top, we ensure that the randomization of this modifier doesn't go too wild by multiplying with the previous changes on top of themselves. And just like with the frizz hair curves, this preserve length button here at the bottom just tells Blender to look at how long the hair was before this modifier, and then ensure that after all the changes, it remains roughly that same length. And that's it for the changes. So we can go over here and twirl this closed. And we won't be adjusting this surface deform, as this really doesn't have any changes for us. It's just a necessary modifier for this effect to work. So we can leave this one collapsed. Now that we've adjusted all these modifiers, let's just zoom in here. And I'll give you a really quick rundown, again, just a basic terms of what each of these modifiers are doing for us. So to begin with, the set hair curves profile is changing how thick the hair is. Next up, we have the trim hair curves. This changes how long the hair is. Then we have the interpolate hair curves. This is primarily adjusting how dense the hair is, and also where the hair is allowed to grow. In our case, we told it not to grow in the nose, and we told it to not grow behind the eyes. After that, we adjusted the curl hair curves, which adds a little bit of a corkscrew curl to each of these hairs. We can see that here if we zoom in. A lot of these hairs have kind of a circular curl on them. Then we started adjusting the frizz hair curves, which is where we're getting a lot of this kind of zigzag pattern. We can see that sort of squiggly pattern here on each of these hairs. And then lastly, the hair curves noise just adds a little bit of randomness and chaos to the hair to make it feel a bit more natural and less generally computer generated. Okay. So before we end the lesson, let's head over to the rendering workspace and see what this fuzz actually looks like. So I'm going to zoom out here quick, and then we can go over here to the rendering workspace found here at the top. Now we can render our image by going over here and choosing render, render image, or just by hitting F12. I'll see you in just a moment when my image finishes rendering. Okay, so the render is done and it looks interesting. We knew already that the fuzz wouldn't be the correct color, but it does feel a bit different when you see the full effect of all the fuzz on this surface. So we can zoom in here now and see how much more dense this fuzz is. And we can see all these little curly hairs here and how it's frizzy, and just all of the different effects kind of coming together to make this overall effect. Even though the fuzz isn't the correct color, it's still really cool to look at the edges of the model and see the curly, fuzzy strands making the fox's head look almost like woolly felt. We can see an example of that here, and just around the faces, especially around the edges where it's the most noticeable. Just imagine how much better this is going to look when it's all the correct color. In the next lesson, we'll create the material for the fuzz that we just added. I'll see you there.